What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial Series, we are going to be going over Tag Team Matches Part 1. So all we're going to do in this episode is set up the behavior to perform Tag Team Matches. There's going to be a lot of behavior that goes into this system, so we're starting off simple. We're going to get rid of all the tedious stuff right now, which is setting up the inputs, making sure that it's firing, setting the correct mode in the game instance so we can track it. But in a few episodes, we'll actually cover switching control of the characters, adding health bars and images for those characters to the UI, and really exciting fun things like that. But for now, the important base work, and that is going to be determining if we can switch to a character by pressing an input. So I can press this input. The first one was for player 1, the second one was for player 2, and it says the current character is being tagged out for another character on the team in one mode. This value is tied to an enum value that we have in the code. I'll go over that more as we get farther into the episode. But the important part to note here is that we are able to trigger a function to tag our characters out. And what we're going to do in the next episode of the Tag Team mini-series here, we want to actually swap characters. So the character will likely drop in from the side they're on. So if they're on the left side here, maybe drop in from the top left, or run in from the ground on the left side here. And for those that aren't aware, tag matches basically are just matches that have more than one character on a team. So we could have 2 characters, maybe even 3 characters fighting against another team of the same size, another 2 or 3. And if you want to get even more advanced than that, you could separate the team sizes. Sometimes you could have 3 characters on a team and they're fighting 1 character, but that 1 character has a huge advantage over the other 3 through handicaps, extra damage, extra health, things like that. So this is a really exciting opening to a brand new system and one of my favorite systems. If you want to get caught up in the series before going over this episode so you're familiar with how the rest of the game works, from the combat, the throws, the hitboxes, and all this fun stuff, I'll link you to the top right corner right here, which is the fighting game playlist where you can see the 228 episodes prior to this one. Additionally, if you don't care about that and you only care about tag matches, I'll recommend you watch this episode right here. That is going to play into how we set up our game instance and tag matches today. So I do recommend watching that one before watching this one. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series. We're going to do pretty much everything in the code today. And starting off, we need to go to our edit, project settings, and add some input actions for tagging in and tagging out characters. So tagging out means I'm getting rid of this character that I'm currently playing as. I'm switching them out for another character. The character that's coming in to replace them is being tagged in. I'm going to scroll down to my input section here, and I'm going to add 2 action mappings, one for tag out for player 1 and one for tag out for player 2. In this series, remember, we support both keyboard and controllers, so if you're on controllers, you don't need tag out P1 and tag out P2. You only need 1 input action, but if you do want to support multiple characters on the same input device, like we have in the series, then you'll want to tag out P1 and tag out P2. So I've done that, and if you're using enhanced input, that's perfectly fine. You can still do this method. In fact, I have an episode on enhanced input that you could use to set your system up that way. But I'm still using my input actions and input axes, so I'm adding 2 more action mappings here, again calling them tag out P1 and tag out P2. For the inputs, I've made them left bracket for player 1 and left bracket. Okay. For player 1, I've made it left bracket. For player 2, I've made it right bracket. Additionally, the tag out P1 should have another node here. So if I press add action mapping to group, I can get another control. We want to use the input that we'll use on a controller to tag out for both players. And specifically, we're looking at X input devices here. So let's say maybe the left trigger, I think would be a good tag button. Gamepad left trigger. We don't need the axis in this case, just if the left trigger is pressed or released, we'll know that we should tag out this character. So this is how I'm setting up all of my input actions for this tag system. Now, as we get farther into this episode, you'll see that I do have support for both 2 players on a team and 3 players on a team, because some games do have 3 players in one tag match. However, I only have 1 button to tag out right now, so if you do want to support 3, you'll likely want to add another tag out button, like tag out 2 P1, tag out 2 P2, which means they can tag out with that 3rd reserve character instead of the 2nd one. But it's up to you, and that's probably something we'll cover anyway in the series. If you want to get a head start, you can add that now. Otherwise, this is what I have. Make sure you memorize these names. we're going to need to use them exactly with the same case and everything in the code. So I'm going to close this and I am going to go into the code. Now here we are in the code. I want to go to my base player controller.h first because this is where we can start mapping the controls. So scrolling down here, I'm going to make two new functions, call tagout and call release tagout. With a lot of functions that I have in the base player controller, these functions are essentially just going to call the character functions. There's a lot more we can do with them in the series, but for now, we're still just passing the function along to the character saying, yes, the player controller has pressed this input, so the character that we are controlling should handle this behavior. And in this case, it's going to be tagging out the character, so whatever we want our tag out logic to be. Because we have it set up that way, I have two functions, call tagout and call release tagout. Call tagout is when the tagout button is pressed. So as soon as I press the left bracket, the right bracket, or the left trigger on a controller, we're going to call tagout. This is also U function blueprint callable, so we can call it from a blueprint. The reason this is required is because of our keyboard mode, the player 1, player 2 inputs I was mentioning earlier in the project settings. Now, call release tagout is called when the tagout button is released. This is another one, you don't necessarily need it. You could bind actions depending on if you held the tagout button or if you're tagging out when you're performing a certain command. You may want to check for things like that. So it gets really tricky. A lot of games do it differently. I'm going to support it in this series. So this is called when we release the tagout input. It is also U function blueprint callable. Now once we've made those two functions, let's go into the base player controller.cpp. And let's scroll down to our setup input component function where we can bind our tagout input actions to our function call. So here we go toward the bottom here. I'm going to map them. So I have these two input component bind action calls right here. So input component bind action, we need to use the exact name of the input action, which is tagout P1. IE pressed means when we press this input. This object, this instance of the base player controller is what's going to call the function or what we're handling this behavior on. And the function we're calling is a base player controller call tagout. So essentially we press the tagout button and we call this function. I have another one right under this, tagout P1 for IE released, so that when we release the tagout button, this instance of this base player controller class is going to call release tagout. So now our press and our release for our tagout button or input is all set up. Now we need to make these two functions. So I'm scrolling down to where I want to add them. And the first one I want is void a base player controller, : call tagout. In here, I'm checking to see if there's a pawn that this player controller possesses. If there is, we go ahead and use possess pawn to call tagout. This is a function we're going to call on our fighter template character. So let's actually go and make that now so we can do that. So fighter template character.h. I'm going to scroll down to my functions. And right here I've made a new function, tag out. Tag the character out. Swap for a reserved character on the team. The function is literally void tag out, doesn't take any parameters, anything like that. Once we've made this function in the character.h file, we can go into the fighter template character.cpp, scroll down to where we want to make the tag out function. For now, let's just write void a fighter template character : tag out, and then put our curly braces in. Everything that I'm highlighting on the screen now we'll add in a few minutes. Let's go back to our base player controller.cpp at this point. And in call tagout, we want to make sure we use our possess pawn to now call that tagout function that we made in the fighter template character. So the player controller processes the input, then calls the fighter template character tagout function, which is going to actually handle the tagout behavior. Now in the base player controller, I've also set up our call release tagout. So void a base player controller : call release tagout. I don't have any behavior in here yet because the behavior has not been defined. However, this is really useful if you want your tagout to not be an input action, but you want it tied to a command on your character. You could easily add your tagout functionality to a command. Say press light and heavy together, tags your character out, and swaps characters. If that's the case, you will need to know when you've released your tagout button or tagout input. That way it can be properly added to the input buffer and checked against the command in the command list. I'm not handling it that way, so I don't need it. So for now, I'm just leaving this empty. You can ignore it for now if you'd like, or you can set it up and just leave it here. If we don't end up using it, we can always remove it, but now we have the ability to add on to it in the future. Because we're not actually doing anything with release tagout right now, we don't need a corresponding fighter template character function, so we're good to go here. Now that's our base player controller. Let's go into our base game instance.h now. Remember, the base game instance is a class that persists between levels and loads and all these things, so we can track data in there that we want to be persistent through the entire session. In this case, we want to track what type of game we're currently playing in terms of team. So like, are we doing a solo 1v1? Are we doing a tag match? Could be a 2v2, 3v3. And I'm opting to track that using an enum. So if we scroll down to the bottom of our enum list here, I've made another enum, specifically an enum class called eTeamModeType. UEnum blueprint type just means that we can access this enum in the blueprint and use it to set up structures and things like that. And we're likely going to need this when we set the value through one of the menus, so it's good to have access to this in the blueprint. Then I'm making an enum class called eTeamModeType, like I mentioned earlier. It is of type unsigned integer 8-bit, or uint8. Now for my values, I have e_solo, which for uMetaDisplayName just says solo, e_duo for uMetaDisplayName says duo, and e_trio uMetaDisplayName says trio. Remember, these uMetaDisplayNames just change the name of the enum when we're looking at it in a blueprint to be the text we have in quotes here. e_solo, it would just say solo, and same with duo and trio. So pretty simple here. Solo means one character on a team, duo means 2 characters on a team, and trio means 3 characters on a team. Once you have this enum class set up, let's go ahead and make a variable of this enum. So scrolling down my base game instance, I've made a new variable of eTeamModeType called TeamModeType. As the comment says, this is the current team mode type, so solo, duo, etc. It could be more than trios, you might even have quads. Now, I did make this a U property of edit anywhere blueprint read write, so we can access it and edit it in the blueprint. This is going to be very useful for us in the future, and I've given it a category of mode values so we can more easily find it. It's just keeping track of the values of the mode, quite literally, same as the game mode type. This is actually tracking like story practice online versus those sorts of things. The same deal, we just want to track what type of session we're in, that way we know what behavior we can and can't do. Once you've done that, let's go ahead and assign a default value for the base game instance. So in my constructor here, where we set all the default values for our variables, I'm setting my team mode type to be eTeamModeType e_duo. This is just for demonstration purposes, so that we can show that this is working. We'll want to modify this to make it start out as solo by default if it is a solo game. Of course, it will change as we are in the menus. If we're going to a tag team match, then we're going to want to swap this value at that point. But by default, I think it should be solo. Something else we actually haven't done in here that we probably should is set the default values for some of our other enums. Like the game mode type doesn't get set to a default value, and neither do the character classes or the music type. So I'm actually going to do that now, because why not? So let's go ahead and go into our constructor again, and I'm going to set character class. It's P1 character class specifically equals e character class, and we're going to say default, and same for P2 character class. Now I want to set my game mode type to be e game mode type, and we're going to start as story by default. Remember, all these values get set when we're in the menus, when we're selecting our options. This just helps make things a little bit cleaner for us so we know what the default values are. And I'm also going to set the music type to be e music type default. That's something we should have done earlier in the series, but I just never did, so now we're doing it. At this point, we can go back to the fighter template character.cpp and look at our tagout function. We're going to finally fill out the lines that I highlighted earlier. The very first thing we need to do is get a reference to our game instance, because we want to check what type of mode it is. We don't want to be able to tag out in something like solos mode, so we need to make sure we're in the proper mode to be able to perform a tag out at all. And the way we can do this is by getting the current game instance, casting it to U-base game instance, which is the type of game instance that we have in our series. So this is my custom instance, the one that we were adding those enums to. And if this cast succeeds, it will be put into this variable. So if auto base game instance equals the cast, this will return true if the cast was able to be assigned to it, meaning we go inside of this if statement. Then we want to check and see if the base game instance team mode type is not equal to team mode type : e_solo. So if we are not in a team mode of solo, basically we're playing a tag match, then we can go ahead and tag out the character. For this episode, all I'm doing is just writing a log to make sure we know it's working. That's what you saw at the start of this episode. So UE log, using log temp, which is the default log in Unreal. Warning to make the text yellow, and then for the actual text I wrote out the current character is being tagged out for another character on the team in %d mode. %d stands for decimal, and basically after the parenthesis for the text we can add a comma and then pass in a value that would be displayed in the log. So in this case %d is going to be replaced with base game instance team mode type. Remember, our enum is essentially just an unsigned integer 8-bit, and so it can be read as an integer value. You could also do %i for integer, either one will work. Enums also start out as 0 by default, so if we're looking at our enum in the base game instance, solo is 0, duo is 1, trio is 2. So if we go back to the player template character, you were seeing 1 in one mode at the start of this episode. That's what it said. That means the mode was being read as duos, which is correct because that's what we set as our default value in the base game instance. Now at this point you can go ahead and launch the editor, and I'll catch up with you when that's done. Now that we're back in the editor, we want to go to our base character BP to make sure that this also works for our second player on the same input device. So base character BP. And in here, very similarly to my other input actions I have in here, I'm just grabbing my input action that is labeled P2, so input action tag out P2. That gets me this node right here, and at this point I want to do the same thing as all my other ones, so I want to grab my player2 reference, get it, convert it to a validated get, because we only want to do this if player2 reference is valid. Doing this on both press and release so that we can call the corresponding function either way. Off the reference, I'm getting the controller, get controller, and I'm casting it to our controller, which is base player controller for both instances here. And on the press, I am calling call tagout, and on the release, I should be calling my call release tagout. Even though I'm not really using it yet, might as well put it in here just so we have all the options available to us. At that point we can compile and save and test it, make sure it's working. Now when we come into the game here, we can skip through everything and make sure that our log is printing. That's the main thing we want to happen. So make sure you open up your output log and make sure, and you can see it's printing for both player 1 and player 2. Now, if we were to close this one more time and go back to our base game instance.cpp and then change the default value for the team mode type to e_solo, save and build this again. This time when we load up the game, no log should print because it should not print. We shouldn't try and do the tag out behavior if we're in a solos match. So now I'm going to press the same buttons and you'll see no logs print, which is exactly what we want. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope this helped you start your tag system. We have a lot more to do with this, but this is a very good base to begin with. If you enjoyed, please subscribe and consider joining the Patreon, YouTube membership, and Discord subscriptions for extra benefits and to support the channel further. If you had any issues with this tutorial or ran into any trouble, feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description and I would be happy to help you with that. That support is completely free. Anyway guys, that's all I got for you today, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye guys.